If you think a government drowning in debt will solve the problem by becoming more disciplined, you have not been studying governments. You have been studying fairy tales. I have spent my life watching people look at numbers and miss the mechanism underneath them. They stare at the surface, they stare at the headline, they stare at the giant debt total and ask the wrong question. They ask whether America can pay it back. That is not the real question. The real question is this: in what kind of dollars will it be paid back? And what will those dollars still be worth when the bill comes due? That is where most people get fooled. They think debt is destroyed in a dramatic moment. A default, a panic, a loud political fight, a televised collapse. Most of the time, that is not how large debt burdens die. Large debt burdens usually die quietly. They die by changing the value of the measuring stick. They die because the system makes cash weaker, assets more expensive, and savers slower than inflation. The debt does not disappear on paper. Its real weight just gets lighter while ordinary people are still using old language to describe a new reality. I want to say this as plainly as I can. When a nation becomes too indebted to fix the problem, honestly, it begins searching for an escape route that does not feel like an escape route. It does not call it surrender, it calls it policy. It does not call it a transfer of wealth, it calls it stabilization. It does not call it reducing the burden of debt through weaker money. It calls it growth, accommodation, support, resilience, flexibility, stimulus, reform, or modernization. The label changes, the mechanism does not. You can spend your whole life becoming a careful saver and still lose. If you misunderstand that mechanism, I have seen people work 30 years, do the right things, avoid foolish speculation, build what they believe is prudence, and then discover too late that prudence measured in nominal dollars is not the same thing as prudence measured in purchasing power. A pile of money can grow in appearance while shrinking in reality. That is one of the oldest tricks in economic life. And because it happens slowly, people mistake it for normality. The system does not need your consent to run this play. It only needs your confusion. That is the part I want you to understand tonight. The loud version of the story is entertaining. Somebody on the internet tells you there is a secret plan, a hidden switch, a single person about to walk into a building and erase the debt with one brilliant move. That fantasy spreads because people like clean villains and magical solutions. Real systems are more dangerous than that because they do not depend on one dramatic act. They depend on incentives. They depend on pressure. They depend on what becomes politically easier once honest options are too painful. And the easiest route in a debt-heavy system is almost always the same. Keep rates below the real rate of inflation long enough, keep liquidity flowing long enough, protect the structure long enough, and let time do the dirty work. Let inflation shave the real burden. Let nominal growth create the illusion of progress. Let asset prices climb. Let cash stand still. Let fixed salaries lag. Let fixed income savers call themselves conservative while they slowly finance the adjustment. That is not a conspiracy. It is a protocol. Most people hear that and immediately think I am describing a dramatic destruction of the dollar. That is not what I am describing. Extreme collapse is not required. A system does not need to kill the currency to damage the saver. It only needs to make the saver earn less than the silent erosion. That is enough. If your bank pays you 3 while the real world takes away 5, the theft does not feel cinematic. It feels boring. That is why it works. Boring losses are the losses most people tolerate the longest. I learned early that if you want to understand the future, you do not begin with speeches. You begin with incentives. You ask what each major actor cannot allow to happen. You ask what pain the political system will refuse. You ask which losses will be hidden and which will be visible. Politicians hate visible pain. Central bankers hate disorderly pain. Voters hate immediate pain. Large institutions hate asset deflation. Debtors hate high real rates. Governments hate austerity. Those preferences do not tell you everything, but they tell you enough. They tell you which outcome has friends. Cash does not have many friends in that environment. The ordinary saver imagines cash as neutral. It is not neutral. In a debt-stressed world, cash is a volunteer. It is the part of society that quietly absorbs the adjustment. It gives up purchasing power without a hearing. It does not ring a bell. It does not send an alert to your phone. It just becomes less capable, while the account statement still behaves politely. That is why I do not want you thinking about this problem as a debt story. I want you thinking about it as a measuring stick story. If the ruler is shrinking while you are measuring your life with that ruler, you can be fooled for years. People also get confused because they assume there are only two endings. Either the government pays every obligation back in full-strength dollars, or it defaults outright. That is childlike thinking. There is a third road, and historically it is the road powerful systems prefer. They service the debt, they refinance the debt, they stretch the debt, they monetize around the debt, they tolerate just enough inflation, they shape just enough repression, they encourage just enough nominal growth, they keep the show running while the real burden gets worked down in the background. The debt remains, the saver changes. That is the real transfer. I want to make this mechanical, because if you do not turn it into a mechanism, you will reduce it to a slogan, and then forget it. Here is the first mechanism. I call it the erosion engine. A government with too much debt does not need miracles. It needs time and negative real returns for the people financing that debt. If inflation runs above the yield ordinary savers earn, the real value of old liabilities is reduced. The government repays in currency that buys less. Anyone sitting in low-yield cash or long-duration fixed claims becomes part of the cleanup crew. Whether they know it or not, they think they are staying safe. In reality, they are allowing their claim on future goods and services to thin out. Here is the second mechanism. I call it the asset elevator. When money is easier, when liquidity is abundant, when nominal dollars multiply faster than real production, good assets do not stay politely priced. Productive businesses, scarce real estate, strong brands, royalty streams, energy assets, infrastructure, and other things tied to real economic output tend to reprice, not because they became magical, but because the denominator changed. If more dollars chase a limited pool of durable earning power, owners of durable earning power usually win. That is why debt-heavy eras often feel cruelly unfair. The people who already own productive things see their balance sheets swell. The people who stayed in cash watch the entry price move away from them. Here is the third mechanism. I call it the obedience trap. Once a saver has spent years behaving cautiously in nominal terms, that saver becomes emotionally attached to the instruments that are quietly destroying him. He mistakes familiarity for safety. He says, "At least my money is not at risk in the market." What he means is, my loss is happening in a way that does not upset me emotionally. That is not the same as safety. That is anesthetized decline. I want you to sit with that because it is one of the most expensive misunderstandings in personal finance. A man can avoid volatility and still get poorer. A family can avoid panic and still lose ground. A retiree can collect interest and still experience confiscation. A country does not need to seize your money if it can persuade you to hold the wrong form of it. Now let me take this one step further. The people hurt most by this kind of environment are often the people who believe they are the most disciplined. The improvised speculator at least knows he is gambling. The rigid saver believes he has already solved the problem. That makes him slower to adapt. He confuses no movement with no risk. He sees the number staying still and feels secure. Meanwhile, groceries, insurance, labor, shelter, healthcare, and replacement costs keep repricing around him. The world does not care whether you intended to preserve purchasing power. It only cares whether you actually did. That brings me to the most dangerous illusion in this entire subject. People think the threat is some future event, some announcement, some policy pivot, some famous official saying the wrong sentence on television. I do not see it that way. The real threat is that the process has already become culturally normal. The saver has already been trained to accept low real returns as prudence. The employee has already been trained to treat nominal raises as progress. The citizen has already been trained to think a rising stock market means prosperity everywhere, even when the distribution effects are brutal. When the rules of a game become invisible, the game becomes very powerful. So if you ask me whether there is a master plan to erase the debt, my answer is simpler and more unsettling. I do not believe in a magic trick. I believe in pressure. I believe in incentives. I believe in a debt system that will almost certainly prefer the quiet path over the honest path. I believe in a monetary operating system that would rather dilute than detonate. And I believe millions of people will be hurt, not because they were lazy, but because they were using 20th century habits inside a 21st century debt machine. That is the diagnosis. Now, I want to talk about the identity flip, because this is where the entire thing becomes practical. Most people still think like depositors in the world I am describing. Depositors are the raw material. Owners are the beneficiaries. That sentence may sound harsh. It is still true. When the system needs relief, it does not usually reward the person who merely stores currency. It rewards the person who owns claims on production, scarcity, pricing power, or replacement cost. If you own a great business, that business can usually reprice its product over time. If you own scarce land in a place people want to be, replacement costs can work in your favor. If you own a firm with strong margins and necessary products, inflation does not hit you the same way. It hits the household living on a static paycheck and a stagnant savings account. If you own only cash and promises fixed in nominal terms, you are standing still in a world built to move around you. That is why I keep telling you not to ask whether your account balance is growing. Ask whether your claim on future life is growing. There is a profound difference between the two. I have always preferred buying productive assets to making macro forecasts, because macro forecasts tempt people into performance. They want to sound brilliant. They want to predict dates and numbers and dramatic turning points. The better game is simpler. You do not have to predict every move. You have to understand the direction of pressure and position yourself on the side of the structure that benefits if money gets cheaper in real terms. That is a much more useful blueprint. If you think of your life as a personal central bank, your job is not to maximize appearances. Your job is to preserve command over real goods and services. That means you need your own household protocol, your own debt era blueprint. Otherwise, you will get pulled into the national protocol by default, and the national protocol is not designed to protect passive savers. My blueprint has 3 parts. The first part is to stop measuring wealth in nominal dollars alone. I want you to start using a second scoreboard immediately. What can your capital buy in terms of productive ownership? Housing years, energy, food, healthcare, education, and resilient optionality. If the number in the account rises but your purchasing reach does not, you are not richer. You are being cosmetically comforted. A great many people spend 10 years being cosmetically comforted. The second part is to move from idle claims to productive claims wherever your temperament allows. I am not telling you to become reckless. I am telling you to understand the hierarchy: cash for liquidity and survival, productive assets for long-term defense. If you leave too much of your life in instruments designed mainly for emotional reassurance, then emotional reassurance becomes the most expensive luxury you own. I would rather have modest cash reserves and strong productive claims than a flattering bank balance slowly being hollowed out. The third part is to build pricing power into your personal life. Most people hear that phrase and think only of corporations. I do not. Pricing power also matters in households. Can you earn in a way that adjusts? Can you own skills that remain needed? Can you operate a small business? Can you create a side income tied to a real market rather than a fixed salary grid? Can you reduce dependence on systems that reprice against you? The family with optionality is less fragile than the family with a single static stream of income and a large pile of passive cash. I know some people want a more dramatic answer. They want a single trade, a single asset, a single hero move. That is not how I think. I think in structures. The saver who survives a debt-heavy era usually does 3 things at once. He keeps enough liquidity not to be forced into stupidity. He owns productive assets, so the denominator can work for him rather than against him. And he refuses to confuse stillness with safety. That is the household protocol. Now, let me tell you where people get trapped. They get trapped in concentration dressed up as conviction. One man hides everything in cash because it helps him sleep. Another hides everything in gold because he wants a story dramatic enough to match his fear. Another hides everything in one part of the market because it went up last cycle and made him feel intelligent. Another does nothing because he thinks caution means waiting for certainty. All 4 men are serving emotion first and structure second. That is not investing. That is autobiography with a brokerage account. The debt era punishes autobiographical investing. It rewards disciplined ownership. If I were 60 with most of my net worth sitting in low-yield cash, I would not ask whether the official debt number is frightening enough. I would ask a harder question: if the purchasing power of that cash erodes meaningfully over the next decade, what part of my future am I really leaving undefended? Housing, medical choice, family help, travel, dignity, flexibility, legacy, time itself. Once you phrase the problem that way, it stops sounding abstract. It becomes moral. Because losing purchasing power is not an accounting event. It is a life event. Maybe you help grandchildren less. Maybe you delay treatment. Maybe you keep working longer. Maybe you become dependent at exactly the age you wanted independence. That is what people mean when they say inflation is a tax. They say it casually. I do not mean it casually. I mean it literally reshapes human choices. This is why I have always admired people who can look at a system without sentiment. Sentiment is expensive in economics. It causes people to defend the world they wish existed instead of adapting to the world that does. The world that does exist is one where debt this large creates a gravitational field. It bends policy, it bends incentives, it bends behavior, it bends returns, it bends politics, it bends the future value of money itself. If you are standing outside that field pretending it has no influence, you are not being principled. You are being naive. And I have no interest in your being naive. I want you to be calm. I want you to be rational. I want you to stop searching for dramatic headlines and start identifying quiet transfers. That is where real money is won and lost. The hardest part for most people is not understanding the logic. The hardest part is admitting that the old scorecard is no longer enough. They want to believe that earning, saving, and staying conservative will automatically protect them. Those habits are admirable. They are not sufficient by themselves. In a debt, heavy age, old virtue without new structure can still produce a weak result. That is why I call this a mirror moment. The debt is not just a national problem, it is a mirror held up to your household design. It reveals whether you are an owner or merely a holder. Whether your savings are organized around purchasing power or around appearances. Whether you are building a life robust to policy drift or one dependent on yesterday's monetary assumptions. A lot of people do not want to look in that mirror because they know what they will see. They will see too much idle cash, too much faith in nominal statements, too much emotional dependence on feeling safe, too little productive ownership, too little pricing power, too little structure. Good. That discomfort is useful. False comfort is what destroys people here, not uncomfortable clarity. So let me bring this to a final threshold. Do not leave this video asking whether some official is secretly planning to cancel the debt. Leave with a better question. If the debt burden is mostly resolved the way large debt burdens are usually resolved, through years of silent erosion, controlled repression, and asset repricing, what side of that transfer am I standing on right now? That is the final test. Not what you believe politically, not which party you blame, not which famous person you distrust, not whether the rhetoric is dramatic enough. Where are you standing in relation to the transfer? If most of your life is still denominated in instruments that need stable purchasing power to protect you, then you are standing on the wrong side of the bridge. If your capital increasingly lives in productive claims, scarce claims, flexible claims, and adaptive claims, then at least you have given yourself a fighting chance to cross. I cannot make the national debt small for you. I cannot make the monetary system simple for you. I cannot promise that every productive asset will behave well every year. What I can tell you is this: the saver who waits for official confirmation always moves too late. The person who needs the system to announce the transfer before acting will usually be one of the people funding it. So tonight I want you to write something down. Write the number you keep in cash and low yield instruments. Write the number you keep in productive ownership. Write the percentage of your future that depends on yesterday's dollars holding tomorrow's value. Then ask yourself one brutal question. Am I preserving wealth, or am I preserving the feeling of wealth? There is a world of difference between those two things, and your future will be priced in that difference. Make a contract with your future self tonight. Not a wish, not a slogan. A contract. I will stop measuring safety by stillness. I will stop confusing nominal comfort with real protection. I will build my household so that if the system chooses the quiet path, I am not the one paying for it in silence. That is how adults handle a debt age, not with panic, not with fantasies, with structure, with ownership. with a clear-eyed understanding that when the measuring stick is changing, the person who adapts first is not paranoid. He is simply early.